And a very pleasant afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this evening's exercise. There we look at the program entitled Behind the Veil, Inside the Mind of Men Who Abuse. I believe it is a well deserved and topic that needs to be discussed. But before we go on any further, noting well that in all our ways we acknowledge God, the source of all wisdom. We reverently bow at this time and acknowledge God as the wonderful counselor. Pastor Lowe.
Our Father in heaven, we are privileged to be able to approach your people and obviously be guided by you. And you have said, if anyone lack wisdom, to ask of God. And so now we ask of you to give us the wisdom so that we can understand all the various facets of this wide but great and significant topic. And so, Father, now may your Spirit be with us. Please help our listeners too as they hear what is presented, that it may be relevant and it will be pertinent to their understandings and their challenges that they face at the moment, so that some soul, the men here, will be blessed. Some of them may not even recognize that this program is for them. So, Father, bless them, help that your Spirit will bring them to hear and understand and be able to make the necessary adjustments. Bless all the presenters as we forge to guide your people aright. And again, we ask for your wisdom and your understanding as we present. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Behind the veil, inside the mind of men who abuse. You know what we have seen in the recent months and with added frequency within the last few weeks has forced our nation to begin a conversation on abuse, and more so, abuse of women. This is certainly a human tragedy that is begging for a collective human response. And of course, the church is seeking to do just that. You know, we are told that worldwide, 1 in 3 women is a victim of sexual or domestic abuse or violence at some point in their life. And note you well, over 38% of the murders of women are committed by male partners. So we do have a challenge. Our intent today, Trinidad and Tobago, and those who might be listening and watching in the wider world, is not to downplay the emotional impact and the physical loss the families affected would have had. In fact, we grieve with those who have suffered loss, our own parishioners, our fellow colleagues, and the national community. We grieve with them just the same. However, this is about looking inside the mind of men who abuse, an in-depth look into the psyche of the abuser, with a panel of professionals, I must say. We intend to talk to men this evening, not to talk about men. This is not a bashing exercise. We want to talk to men, hoping that at the end, men will revisit their past without blaming, hiding, or making excuses, rather, to fully understand his story and prepare for his future. A future that is meaningfully lived without causing pain and loss to others. It is a fact, people, that every man has a story, and every man is in the midst of a story. All we have seen, shaped by defining moments, decisions, painful experiences, and personal relationships, would have shaped that story. And it also requires then a careful looking back, making meaningful assessments of, in order for the future to be related to in a meaningful way. When this is done, only then can life experiences be related to in a meaningful way, breaking free from the reference point that may have very well served as the catalyst for people's what I will describe internal monologue. As a man, and we are hoping that this program will bring in to bring to the fore, to the surface, their heart in order for them to appreciate the story that is driving them, what hurt, and maybe what is still hurting. Who taught them how to love a woman, really? Who showed them how to be vulnerable with others? When did they become ashamed of asking questions? How did they get rage and healthy anger confused? When did survival take the place of dreams and getting by take the place of passion? What makes people apologize for being sad or even cry about loss? The answer to these questions are part of their unique story and will open up doors to his present reality. As we begin the conversation, I would like to welcome our distinguished panelists and introduce them to you. And I do this at this given time. We have with us this evening two doctors and two ministers of religion. Dr. Sandra Reed is with us this afternoon, and Dr. Edward Clark is with us just the same. Along with them is Pastor Leslie Moses and Pastor Samuel Lowe. Together, these professionals will share information that will afford a man the privilege of looking back to see what would have shaped his story so that he can understand the story that he's now living in order for him to move forward. And there is a nexus that we want to follow through on this program. We want to take the time to look at the influences that impact a man for him to be an abuser. Then we want to take the time to appreciate the need for every man to take charge of his life, and therefore emotional intelligence got to kick in. After establishing those two things, we will get into the grind of the subject, as it were. So on the word go, may I please invite Dr. Sandra Reed to share with us, the influences that impact a man's life that can very well be the factors for him being an abuser. Dr. Reed? Is Dr. Reed here with me? Okay, we are having some challenges there. Dr. Reed? Okay, we are waiting for Dr. Reed to come in. Dr. Reed? And as she's coming in, I want us to appreciate the preamble that was given and in what context we are hosting this program this evening. While I'm talking, there's I get Dr. Reed here. As I pointed out, we are not necessarily here talking solely about, but we are going to talk to men. The conversation many a times is about talking about men. But every man, as I said earlier on, every man has a story. And every man is living in the midst of that of a story. And it is necessary for that story to be understood. Because that story, to a very large extent, serve as a reference point for him to do his internal monologue. We are still looking forward to Dr. Sandra Reed, and here she is now, Dr. Reed. The question, what are the influences a man is impacted by that may very well cause him to go along the path of being an abuser? Dr. Reed.
Thank you, Pastor Sampson, and good afternoon to my fellow panelists and
Thank
to
you.
all
Good afternoon.
Yes. So there is so much that we can say on this topic. And I want to start by basically just giving a brief overview of aggressive behavior in general and the development of aggressive behavior in men. As one would appreciate, this is a very interconnected and complex matter. But with your indulgence, I'll give a big mouthful of a response that we can chew on. Many would want to start with the idea of testosterone, that male sex hormone, which is associated with aggressive behavior, and the fact that male aggression might be considered normal. But it is clearly not so simple a matter as testosterone makes men aggressive. Because if that was so, then all men would be aggressive. And we know that this is not the case. Where testosterone is concerned, I would put it this way. Men were created with higher levels of testosterone and a more muscular and stronger anatomy to enable them to fulfill their roles as protector of and provider for their families. I guess what I'm saying is that aggression is normal or natural in these contexts to protect and to provide. But one would expect that such expressions are few and not regular behaviors. Another natural expression of aggression by humans, as mad as we are by sin, is the tendency to react with aggression during times of stress or fear or provocation or frustration. Think about it. Even if you are a naturally mild-mannered person, you may find yourself becoming aggressive verbally or even physically. And when that happens, it is probably when you are stressed or provoked. For me, some of my most aggressive moments have been towards mosquitoes when I'm very tired and trying to sleep, believe it or not. These natural aggressive behaviors can be reinforced or discouraged. And unfortunately, in our society, there are several things which tend to promote or reinforce aggression, especially among our men. Please allow me to just share two of the main factors that promote male aggression. I'll just mention two others and we can discuss as the program goes along. First, it's the part of our socialization. Our society teaches us that aggression and violence are signs of manliness, of masculinity. From school days, our sons are told that they have to be tough, they should hit back, they should retaliate. If not, you are weak, you are a sissy. We buy them guns, and in play we have them shoot those who annoy them. A manly man is perceived as an aggressive man. These are gender roles that we have accepted and we continue to perpetuate that make our males much more inclined to aggression. And these aggressive attitudes shift in adulthood to one of dominance and asserting power over others. Male aggression, male dominance, and toxic male power is the norm in our society. Now, when we look at the gender roles where females are concerned, we also accept this perception that women and children can be owned. especially when they are financially dependent on a man. And when that happens, men believe that they are entitled to women, to their bodies, and to the bodies of the children that they support. And they express these feelings through aggression, through violence, through sexual violence. And the society accepts and believes that it is up to women to protect themselves and their children, and that the men are just men. And they act on aggression as they feel, while the women and the children have to protect themselves. Children specifically are seen as having no rights. So that's the first thing, the whole issue of how we socialize men and how we socialize women. Now, because male aggression is so common in the society and commonly expressed in families through harsh physical punishment and domestic violence, there is also the matter of aggression being learned. There was a famous experiment called the Bobo doll experiment, where it was clearly shown that children who observe aggression are more likely to imitate this behavior. And that's explained by the social learning theory. Aggression can also be learned at school, for example, by seeing bullies at school become the heroes. It can be learned through movies and video games, which not only teach aggression, but glorify it and desensitize, so that the negative, painful impact of aggression is not appreciated, which might serve as a deterrent, and more gory aggression is tolerated. Again, I invite you to think about it. Long ago, if there was a report of a human being decapitated or having a limb cut off, that was an unthinkable calamity. Now we hear reports of decapitation, heads being put on counters and bars, limbs being chopped off, and it's business as usual. Just so that I won't go on for too long, I will just mention two of the other factors that are significant contributors to aggression in our era, which we can discuss as the program goes on. This thing of postmodern living, the stresses of life, COVID-19, people studying and working so hard that they do not get enough sleep. All of those things are triggers for aggressive behavior. The ways people commonly cope by the use of alcohol or drugs also contribute to aggressive behavior, and alcohol is a big one here. And then, of course, we have things like the presence of mental illness and some physical illnesses that can also be causes of aggressive behaviors. Put these all together and you will see that we have become a society that breeds a lot of aggressive behavior, especially among men, because in their minds, violence is manly, violence is acceptable and normalized, and for the multiple stresses and disappointments that life throws at them, using violence to cope is an acceptable option, including violence against women, and the children. Thank you.
I had my mic muted. I'm sorry about that one, but I'm pulling on Pastor Lowe. I mean, is there any additional thought you want to bring across here? We have given a beautiful start to the reference point, that which the influences a man's life may be impacted by that drove him there. Do you have any additional thought there, Pastor Lowe?
Yeah, first of all, I must applaud Dr. Reed for a comprehensive overview into all the various factors that can impact a man's aggression and that can possibly end up in abuse. And I think maybe to kind of expand on what she said a little bit, I think based on the socialization factor, how men are socialized a little different than women, sometimes they can end up with what we call psychological wounds. And if untreated, unchecked, if no disclosure at any time, or if it's not dealt with at all, can form a part of that that battery of causes or factors that can end up in abuse. And so a man can see a woman as possibly somebody who, because of his psychological wounds, and when he gets to an age or in a position of power, he can feel that it's his right to possibly vent in a way, if you will, for want of a better term, on women, or if you will, get even. And that can be a result of his psychological wounds if not dealt with adequately as he continues. And sometimes we can feel that how children, how men, how boys grow up, and they're okay. And sometimes the stereotyping with how we treat them and how we deal with their hurts and pains can spin off in how they abuse. So in short, if you've been abused, and Dr. Reed alluded to that in some way, if they see abuse and if they've been abused, there's the likelihood of them becoming an abuser is very high.
To ensure that every listener is following us clearly, you spoke about psychological wounds. That's a term you used a couple of times in there. Can you press a little bit further, Dr. Reed, Dr. Clark, Pastor Moses, anyone can help us there? When the term wounds, that term is used, what are we really saying? What are we saying in this? The wounds that we are referring to, Pastor Lowe, you would have used that phrase.
You want me to continue, or?
I think that term wounds, because we are talking to men, and we want men to understand, hey, the story that you are now functioning with may not be a story that you wrote, but you're in the midst of that story, and you need to be aware of that story. You alluded to wounds there, and for the listeners, I want to ensure that that term is understood.
Well, I think one of the challenges that we face is that we can deal with maybe a cut, and that's a physical cut, but when there's psychological challenges and in the form of abuse, when in our childhood, in the way we grow up, and they become part of how we operate and part of our value systems, if you will, core values. And when they become part of it, in my mind, I think they become a part of us, and abuse gets into there in somehow. And because it's in there, because we've been abused, and so that abuse that we've experienced become part of those psychological wounds, if you will. And so as a result, if they're not dealt with correctly or properly and managed well, that man can become an abuser in his later years.
All right. Any other panelists want to add to the thoughts they expressed?
I would just like to add, Pastor Sampson,
yes.
Dr. Reed alluded to it a little bit, and I have to say she was very comprehensive in her answering to the question. But just before I elaborate a little bit, I'm sure as viewers look on, because we did ask not just that men look on, but we did send a message out to our church members that children look on, or children should be looking on, or boys and girls, because we want to ensure that they understand what they can do. Our women are looking on, I hope, as well, so that they can understand what they can do to help deal with this scourge that we have. And I would make the point that while we're talking about male violence and aggressiveness, we must agree that there is also female violence and aggressiveness. Not that we're dealing with that today, but lest the men among us feel that we are just knocking on their doors. There are other doors that we're knocking on as well. And we have other contributors to family violence, women included. The area I would like to spend a few minutes on is the role of the media in the matter of violence perpetrated in the family. And sometimes we look at movies, we look at shows. Sometimes people look at stuff on the internet and they don't realize the impact that what they see is having on them in terms of their own conceptualization of normal and abnormal behavior. And, you're just calling it out for what it is. There has to be monitoring, I believe, of all forms of media. And I would introduce here, Pastor Sampson, pornographic material, which is also part of media. Those have a significant role to play in how people behave eventually. I'm calling out media for what it is, and the monitoring of media to ensure that all that we must do is against violence in the family.
What I'm gathering then, it is quite, and correction may be required here, but what I'm gathering, it seems to me as though a man may very well be scripted in a particular way, as a local in wounds, and he can be functioning with relative comfort, even though it is filled with folly. Is that possible? Any of the panelists, is that possible?
Okay.
For a man to be functioning?
Yes, so...
Yes, Dr. Reed?
Yes, go ahead, Pastor Sampson. I didn't hear the last of what you said. Is it possible for a man to be functioning?
Yes, for a man to be functioning with relative comfort because of his scripting, hurting others but feeling relatively comfortable.
Okay. Yes, I would say...
So we have men out there like that?
Yes, I would say yes to that, definitely. And yes, so we can go back to what the Pastor Lowe's description of the psychological wounds. We could think of it from a very spiritual point of view. God is love, and every created being expects to be loved. And when a child is deprived of love, that creates a psychological wound. Now, that deprivation of love does not have to be overt rejection, because many children perceive a lack of love when they don't have their needs met, when they don't receive the affection that they should get, when they are the victims of aggression, even though that aggression might be well-intentioned as family punishment. And once there is that damage, that wound, that creates a vulnerability. And I think that's the term to describe what you have just expressed. That these, and men and women, so for those persons who think we're talking about people, men and women, but this program is focused on men, so we're going to reference men, right? So these men have vulnerabilities which can be triggered by any present day experience which is reminiscent of that painful past. And as we said before, once that triggering occurs, the natural impulse is aggression. And if you are living in a society that supports that aggression, that doesn't condemn it and say that it's wrong, then people will react aggressively. If we use an example, and I can throw a term into the discussion here, the narcissistic man. The narcissistic man is a man who has been emotionally hurt during his childhood. He has been hurt to the extent that he feels like he's disrespected, he's humiliated, he has no sense of self or self-esteem. This man grows up, and any experience that triggers those feelings of humiliation or belittling will trigger an episode of anger, rage, and aggression. He's not being bad. He's not a sociopath or a psychopath, but he has been socialized. He has had the psychological wounds that predisposed him to an emotionally aggressive outburst in response to a certain trigger. I hope that clarifies a bit more.
Certainly, I saw Pastor Moses indicating, yes, that's on spot, Pastor Moses. Apparently, you need to share something there with us now. And as he's thinking about his response, I'm hearing David's voice saying, listen, I was born in this thing and I grew up in it. It's like, God, the response or the actions of my life right now, they are reflective of where I came from and such alike, and it was feathered in that different negative space. Pastor Moses.
Well, when Dr. Reed, when Dr. Reed spoke, I got so excited because it is clear to me that when we think about aggression and aggressive behavior, especially aggressive sexual behavior, this is a very complex matter, very complex issue. We're talking about socialization, we're talking about childhood issues, we're talking about some personality issues. We refer to one of them narcissism. And the conceptualization of all of these. How do we live out life? How do we relate to people? Some people's inability to function at a normal level in regard to appropriateness in sexuality, appropriateness in relationships. The issues of not knowing what appropriate boundaries are, and just crossing boundaries, doing whatever they think is needed and necessary. And for many of them, this is normal.
Mm-hmm.
Sadly, the home, how we raise our children, how we raise our boys, specifically this afternoon, has a major role to play. Of course, the role of fathers, Pastor Sampson.
Yeah.
And intervening fathers, not just an absentee father, but a father who is present, who is not too busy, who is not too occupied, who is not too spaced out through mental illness or drug use or whatever, but a father who is present in the life of the boy. James Dobson wrote a lovely book entitled Bringing Up Boys. And he makes the point, and I have to reference this over and over. It takes a woman to bear a boy, but it really takes a man to raise a man. While we have women doing a great job, these single parents, these single mothers, and they do a great job, and we thank God for them, I would propose today that if we had more involved fathers in our community, in our homes, then a large percentage of the dysfunction we're seeing with our boys and men would probably be non-existent, and that is what I would say in the matter at this point.
Okay, and you have taken it down now to father wounds now. The lack of a father can really create some serious wounds in the life of their children. Most of our sons we're talking about this evening.
Yeah, as a contributing factor.
Now, noting well that one scripting, and Dr. Reed said yes to my thought there, one scripting can cradle one in a fully full state, even though pain is being exerted on another. Because of that scripting, that person can have relative comfort therein. I'm doing it, and it's normal, as Pastor Moses said. Dr. Clark, how emotional, being aware of your emotion will fit into any kind of self-talk here? Unmute your mic, Dr. Clark.
Been off it so long. Thank you. I said, let me begin by giving you a definition of emotional intelligence, because many of our listeners might not know what it is. So it's our ability to recognize, understand emotions in yourself and others, and it's your ability to use this awareness, the awareness of your emotions, to manage your behavior and relationships. Now, that sounds simple, but it is very difficult, because most of us don't know how to recognize our emotions and even understand our emotions. So to give you an example, I teach a class on emotional intelligence, and these are university students. And you would be surprised to know that most of them get angry, but they don't know why they get angry. And then that anger turns to aggression, and they then blame the other person for making them aggressive, and say, well, had you not done that, I would not have done this. So we are not normally in full understanding of our emotions. But our emotions given by God, let's not knock them. God gave us these emotions so that we can live and interact and fellowship and give him praise and adoration. But the advent of sin has skewed these emotions. And as a result, we have very bad relationship with our emotions. Let me put it to you that way. So, for instance, in the case of domestic abuse, one of the things that has always caught my mind is that no one just develops aggressive, abusive behavior like that. It doesn't just happen with the snap of your finger. Obviously, this is a process. This is a process. And as the other panelists have noted, it starts very early in life and it accumulates. And of course, parents and grandparents and other persons in the child rearing process are so busy providing other physical needs for the children that they say things, behave, act, and we take no cognizance of what we do. All the time, we are making micro impressions and they were developing concepts and perceptions in the minds of children, which, if not addressed, then developed into a mindset, a way of seeing and viewing others, and they act these out if they remain unchecked when they get older. So no one just suddenly says, hey, I'm just going to beat up on someone. Or no, it doesn't just happen like that. So really, domestic violence can be seen as a severe form of relationship dysfunction, a severe, but between the onset and the severity that we call domestic violence, there's an intervening period and layers of behavior that is taking place that is not really caught, is not grabbed, is not treated, is not brought to the fore. And I'm amazed again as we do this course on emotional intelligence, and I do these reflective assignments. I'm amazed sometimes with the things that the students say happened to them, and it just happened, and it just like they just see it as part of living. But they have come, when we finish, they've come to realize, wow, this happened to me. I did nothing about it. No one addressed it. So now when I get to this point, here's what's happening to me, and this is why it's happening. So abusive men have a history of dysfunctionality, negative thoughts, dysfunctional assumptions. They have a history of it. And maybe we could talk a lot about some of these things. They're unassertive most of the times. They're very aggressive of what they want to get, and they'll do whatever they need to get it. Okay, they have issues around communication. They have excuse me. They're unable to verbally articulate their feelings and their thoughts and their needs in a non-destructive way. But in all of this, they are really insecure, and they're fearfully attached to their intimate partners. And they have, even though they're aggressive, they are afraid that their partner might leave them. And it's an interesting thing. It's very cyclic, because you're aggressive, even though you know your partner might leave you. But if you could put fear in her, then she's less likely to leave you. So they are functioning in a state of anxiety. They're also functioning low self-esteem. They are functioning in a way where you have slights. Small things can trip them out because they internalize these slights as damaging to their ego, how they see themselves. And that's how it is. It is really a vortex of emotional complexity when you come to deal with batterers, as they're called, domestic violence. It's not an easy. There's no easy way of treating it because it involves so many aspects of their personality, and for those of us who know a bit about borderline personalities, someone like that also experiences a lot of insecurity in their relationships. Your mic.
We have looked so far at the influences that can impact a man's life, that can trigger off his response to life in such a harsh way. We looked at some of the issues therein, and then emotional intelligence. And while Doc was talking, he spoke about the need for reflection, the need to reflect. That, to my mind, is a very challenging task for an individual whose scripting would have given to him or her a distorted view of life. Somewhere I read a book that dealt with communication, self-awareness, and the awareness wheel was alluded to. That's a diagram that was given to show how the mind function. I know if Pastor Lowe remembered that one. If he does, Pastor Moses, I know, did that when you look at the family life program, the awareness wheel, how one can do reflection with the sensory data that give rise to thoughts, and thoughts to feelings, and feelings to wants, and then come action. If one could manage what the sensory data is made up of, if one manages that, then the outcome, which is action, can be changed. Anybody want to speak to that now? Because certainly there are persons who are scripted in some negative ways that need to be set free, and reflecting will become necessary. For instance, a young man who would have been raised in an environment where there's a cultural norm where rape is a part of life, and I know of places, of communities that carry life that way. Hey, you're a big man now, and that's a sign that you're a big man, or you're a big woman, and so that those inappropriate sexual behavior is readily accepted. We are now asking that those persons to do some reflecting. Reflection is required in order for them to break free from that. And I'm seeking your assistance in helping those persons there. How that person does, because temptations get started with ruminating, for sure. Somebody please help us there.
Well, I would just want to jump in quickly and say that when it gets to that stage, you need therapy. That's not something that you're going to do. You're going to change on your own. You need to go for therapy and have it done professionally. You don't change behavior by changing behavior. There's a process, and there's the saying: you change your thoughts, you change your life. So you have to go back and start with what is it that set this person on this path? What are the triggers? How can we mediate the triggers? And so it's a process that has to be guided by therapy, whether it's rational emotional group therapy, or and dynamic therapy, or person to person, or whatever. But it has to be, for me anyways, the therapeutic intervention, because I've seen people reading these self-help books to bring about change in some serious personality issues, or serious psychological challenges. And They might do it, they might succeed for like 2 or 3 weeks, but they quickly relapse because they haven't been exposed to the processes of that are involved in bringing about that therapeutic benefit. So
Sorry.
yeah,
Are we
so
then
I'm
suggesting?
saying that it's not something that you can just read a book and sort it out. Very often we we look for the humanistic approach to solve a lot of problems in psychology, and that's one of the challenges. And we don't think about the spiritual approach, but we're beginning to understand that the spiritual approach is equally beneficial, and it's a dynamic intervention along with the humanistic one in bringing about healing. As therapists, we tend to think, okay, here are all the theories, let me take them and let me use them. But I have discovered that the fusion of the spiritual, based on the Bible, and the techniques that we get from therapists and from the disciplines does work quite significantly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in that case, let me go across to one of the theologians then, because we are looking at persons who are stuck with a scripting given to them based on experiences and such like of the past, where they were raised and such a case. We Dr. Clark said that there has to be some skilled intervention for that person to realize in a meaningful way growth. Self-talk will not cut it. That's what I gather.
Yeah.
Then he also alluded to the spiritual aspect of things. One of the theologians helped us say there that there might be a man out there whose scripting may have informed him that this is the way for him to relate to his children, his daughter, his wife, and he's now seeing them going through pain. He knows that it is stupid. He sensed that it is stupid. However, the breakthrough that is needed is a challenge for him here. How can, from a spiritual perspective, that person be helped then?
Can I begin to talk to it a little bit? I don't know if this is where you want to go. The Bible makes a very, very significant point. I'm paraphrasing here. It says, "As a man thinketh, so is he."
Yeah.
I get the impression from that text and my little study into the minds of people. A lot of times, what we think, what we preoccupy ourselves with, is what we eventually play out. And in talking to people, to students, and to others, one of the cautions I share with them is be careful what you think about. Be careful what you look at. I alluded to it earlier, the issue of pornography. I would go one step further to talk about the issue of fantasies. And I'm deliberately contributing, Pastor Samson, this evening to the issue of sexual aggression, because every day I put on the television, I listen to the radio, there is some issue about a man, violating a child, inappropriately touching a child, inappropriately relating to a child as he would relate to an adult. And while we have women doing that too, there is a greater prevalence, of course, of men doing it. Dr. Reed alluded to one of the issues earlier when she introduced the topic, the issue of testosterone. That is not the dominant issue, but it is certainly one of the issues. And I like to say to people, especially to persons who talk with me about exploration, God has given us a mind, and that is a good mind. And we all think about things. We all fantasize about things, especially when we come to knowledge of issues of sexuality and so on. And, you know, for me, a normal spectrum of fantasization would be on the intimate level, where somebody would fantasize about somebody that they really love and they really want to be with, and so on. That's normal. And I would hope that in marriage there is a fantasizing and so on, fantasies and so on. But when that moves to what I would call crossing boundaries and crossing borders, where there is impersonal fantasization and sadomasochistic fantasizing and deviant sexual fantasizing, I think from what I've read, and of course Dr. Reed would be the specialist, Dr. Reed, Dr. Clark would be the specialist in this area. I think that is where things really get bad. You ask for a theological response, a spiritual response. I would say, as we think about what we think about, as we think about what we would think about, we need to be mindful that when we allow ourselves to think in along the lines of areas that, you know, cross boundaries and cross borders. And I'm coming back to the issue of pornography. When people are introduced to pornography, child pornography, sadomasochistic type pornographic material, violent pornographic material, those things stay in the mind because you can think about them. Dr. Clark is right. When we get to the place where these things preoccupy us, then we need to get help. We need to talk to somebody. We need to get counseling. There is, of course, a role for prayer. There is a role for the pastoral counselor, but there is also a significant role for the psychologist and the psychiatrist to help an individual deal with those types of thoughts and sometimes those types of behavior. Sometimes the thoughts are not just, you know, kept in the head, but the thoughts are played out in behavior. And there you need somebody who has the skill to help you deal with that and to get back to a life that could be near to normal, if that is possible at all.
Okay. Pastor Lowe, any response on that issue?
In terms of the abundance of the mind, and
yeah,
you might be able to muzzle your mind for a while, but after a while your mind will begin to influence your actions after a while, and you begin to act just like how you're thinking. What's also true too, the eyes are the windows to the soul, and if we begin to feed our eyes on stuff that's going to put ideas in our minds, we can get to the point where if we feed on stuff that is not uplifting, it's going to help us to get to that point where we just begin to act out. What is also true too, I think about generational curses that people have, you know, inherited, and they've generation after generation. Some of these things are seen as being the norm, and how we treat women, as somebody alluded to a while ago, as property and as possessions. And as men, we can do whatever we want with them. But what's necessarily too, those of us who are churched and religious should have some sort of understanding that even though we might be taught that way, if we allow ourselves to be controlled by Christ, He will be able to break those generational curses and help us to change our thinking in the context of giving us a new mind. And that's essential. A man must choose to get a new mind, and that comes with the power of Christ in his life. But that comes with choice. Just like how he must choose to have therapy, he must choose to allow Christ to change that mind.
Thank you so much. Now, understanding that men are positioned in the manner in which we have just described, being scripted and it calls for some kind of intervention, skilled intervention at that just the same. And to a very large extent, a lot of men refuse to subject themselves to therapy and counseling and such the like. They just simply want to roll along with this macho sense of self. How can persons who are exposed to individuals like that, what should they look out for in order to ensure that some measure of self-preservation is achieved? Because you'll be looking at a process, and a man may be in the process, have not related to his wounds, still struggling with his stories, not relating to that in a significant manner. There's no skillful intervention. He's just rolling along with cultural norms, which might be very negative. His mind is exposed to a whole lot of negative things. But self-preservation is not required for those outside of him. What those persons should be looking for in order to ensure that some measure of self-preservation is achieved. Any other panelists can help us there now, because it's certainly not simply the man's role all alone now, because a lot of them are not getting the help required. Therefore, what should we look out for to ensure that some measure of self-preservation is achieved?
Can I ask clarification? Are you talking from the point of view of the victim, or?
Yeah, that's right. Here is a. Well, we have just discussed about men, where they fit in and such the like, and it calls for therapy and serious counseling and skillful intervention, which may not be the experience of a lot of men. A lot of men are functioning in their brokenness, with their wounds driving them, as it were. And there are persons outside now, persons that they are associating with, may be ignorant as to what should I be looking out for to ensure that I'm not making myself vulnerable to a person who is carrying those wounds, as it were. Are there signs that we can possibly look out for?
Can I start, Pastor Sampson? And I would go beyond the signs, as I talked to at least one of the signs. You know, it was said of one of the most notorious psychopaths, Ted Bundy. It was said of him that he was such a charming guy that by the time you figured out what he was doing, that's an extreme example. It was already too late. There are some people who are very good at what they do, and unfortunately, sometimes it's hard to figure them out. It's hard to pick up on them. If you can pick up on it early enough, then you can save yourself a lot of stress, a lot of trauma. Unfortunately, some of these guys and some of these women who are like this, they are really very charming. They're almost too good to be true. And when you feel that way, then you know that is generally the case. But I think one of the things you can look out for, and we've been discussing it, is aggression. If there is there's aggression in the relationship, aggression in the home, aggressive sexual behavior, that should be some type of signal that something is happening here. If I think there is what I call the unsatiable desire for sexual intimacy, hypersexuality, some people would associate that maybe with sexual, the possibility of sexual addiction. That would be another significant factor. I remember as a young pastor working in a rural district, talking with a woman, and she came to me. I couldn't help her because, you know, I was not prepared to help her. And she said to me, you know, Pastor, I cannot satisfy my husband. Every time, morning, noon, and night, comes home for lunch, and, you know, he wants sexual intimacy. And she said, I'm leaving. I said, oh, you're leaving? She said, I can't take it anymore. And she said, but I can't take my children. And unfortunately, she left her teenage girls, in the home. And she returned a few weeks later to say to me, Pastor, I left because I couldn't take it. And then he turned to his daughters. I'm saying then that sometimes when you see that type of aggression being outplayed, you should take note. It will not always signal that a man will do something to somebody else, but chances are it may happen. Can I say, as I step forward, I'm sure there are other contributors to this matter, but may I say before I shut up, Pastor, I think if a victim has been victimized, one of the things the victim can do is to tell, to speak, to raise the issue, and to say to somebody that this thing has happened. Many perpetrators get away because many victims do not speak up. They do not report. I was reading quite recently that nearly 50% of all rape victims do not report that they have been raped. And of course, when a perpetrator is finally brought before the justice system, before the court, before he's arrested for something that he may have done, as I said to you, my big concern today is the issue of child sexual abuse, Pastor Sampson.
Yes.
And forgive me for focusing on that in what I'm saying to this August assembly today, because I'm really concerned about it. And I'm saying quite often when a perpetrator is found out, it is because there were many, many more other cases of it happening. Because people are just afraid, they're very timid to come out and say he touched me or she touched me, or he played with me and I feel that the play wasn't appropriate, or he's sending me messages or sending me images. There is a hush hush in the community. And let me close by this, Pastor. 25, 30 years ago, the issue of abuse in the clergy, sexual abuse in the clergy came up, and the victims were the ones that were shamed. How dare could you speak like this against my pastor? How dare could you say that my pastor inappropriately touched you as a child? And the victim is there suffering at the hand of the clergy. And with the clergy, I'm not just referring to the pastor, I'm also referring to the people that serve in church, the elders and the deacons and the deaconesses. How dare could you speak like that to these godly people? And from the time the police gets involved and the thing is brought to the place where it should be brought to, it is already too late, because there would have been so many other victims. Because as a church, we think that the pastor can't do that. But I just want to say to parents, I want to say to children if they're looking on, when there is any inappropriateness in regard to sexuality, sexual touching, sexual messages, sexual images, nudity, showing one's sexual parts to a child, that should not be something that we should just pray about and say the Lord is going to bless the pastor and it's going to go away. Brothers and sisters, I'm talking to you directly. Children, I am talking to you directly. That is something to speak about. The question you ask, Pastor, is, what are the signs? Well, these are the signs that people are doing it, and that when it is done, we cannot be silent. We have to speak up that it is happening.
Okay, I want to push a little bit further, because you alluded to a situation where a mom may have left because of whatever given reason, and the father then turned on his daughters for sexual comfort. What should be the response of any person who would have been exposed to that kind of information? What legal requirement is there when it is discovered that a minor is interfered with in such a manner?
Well, let me take a stab at this one first again, Pastor Sampson. I see Dr. Clark wanted to come in there as well. The amendment to the Sexual Offences Act. And if Ramesh Lawrence Miraj didn't, well, he's made a lot of contributions in the council to the landscape of Trinidad and Tobago, but for me, One of his greatest contributions would have been when being Attorney General, he made amendments to the Sexual Offences Act, which now forces parents, forces pastors and teachers, forces therapists, psychologists, and physicians, psychiatrists. Once once it is brought to the knowledge of a helping professional that a child is being sexually abused, there is a right of duty to report. The law makes it mandatory that we report. If we don't report, the act says, there is a fine of, I think it's $15,000 and or 15 years in jail. So sometimes information comes to pastors and they call me and they want to know what to do. And I say, do what the law says. We as pastors, and church leaders and church boards, we don't have the mechanism to investigate whether or not something is true or false. What we have to do is simply do what the law says and report it. There are people who are trained to investigate. There are people who are trained to determine if the child is lying. What we have to do, our role, pastor, and I'm saying this to the whole church, and I'm glad you invited me as the leader of the church pastor to be on this panel. So I'm speaking for the South Caribbean Conference and the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Our responsibility as a church and as leaders, if a child comes and says, Pastor Leslie Moses, touch me in the bathroom, touch me on my penis or on my buttocks, he says that to his pastor, the pastor has a right not to call a church board, not to call the conference president, but to report it to the police. Yes, that would probably wreck Pastor Moses' ministry, because when you lose, you lose. But the law says it has to be reported. If children, of course, have a history of telling lies, then you cautiously deal with it. But generally, they tell us 93% of the times when a child says this has happened, you believe the child and you report it to the police and let the police deal with it thereafter. And we pray for Pastor Moses that hopefully it didn't happen and he will get off.
Okay. Dr. Clark, you were coming in.
I want to bring it closer home and talk about domestic abuse in the church. Because it does happen. And we as a church we have our heads in the sand in relation to that. And we haven't put together either processes, committees, how to solve it, how to deal with it. So we have a lot of persons in the church who are hurting, who are in relationships and they're experiencing abuse. And they go to their pastors and their pastors say, let's pray about it. But there's nothing actually done about it. And therefore, they are frustrated because, the biblical prescript is this, that you stay on death till death us do part, which sometimes is more literal than it should be. So while we are talking about these individuals called batterers, we tend to be focusing outside of the church in a very, hands-off way. But I want us to bring it home in the church and look at it in its entirety and to say, apart from preaching the gospel, what is the church? And as we want to focus it, what is South Karen doing about that? We can't say it doesn't exist because we know it does. And what are we doing about it? What assurance are we giving? What are we telling these individuals? Are we just saying to them, go to the police, leave it at that, we have nothing to do with it? What are we saying about that? And I think if you, this is a concern that our parishioners have. What are we going to do? We can't just hold our hands, wring our hands in frustration. We need to do something. So I don't want us to talk about this domestic violence in abstract, as though it doesn't have anything to do with us. You know. So if I could just refocus it and talk about, you know, how many, hear this, how many persons get referred to counselors or to some agency that can help them? How many? I don't know. I don't know.
Okay. So if I...
What we should do?
Yes, if I may interject here, and I'm glad that Dr. Clark brought it back to domestic violence and abuse in the homes, because child sexual abuse is a specialized matter, and I think the action is clear. This has to be reported. That's the law. But when we talk about domestic violence or aggression in the home, the question was asked earlier by Pastor Sampson. What is a victim to do? If you're living in a home with an aggressor, what is a victim to do? If someone has these scripted behaviors where they interact with aggression, I think that one of the first things to recognize is that you cannot change that individual. We talk about the few people who seek help, and few people seek help because people don't recognize that they need the help. We're talking here about personality disorders. We mentioned narcissistic, we mentioned borderline. We're talking personality disorders where people do not see that they need help or that anything they are doing is wrong. So from the perspective of the victim, that's the first thing to recognize, that you can't make the person change. You can keep the house as clean as you want, the children as quiet as possible. You can do everything that man tells you to do. He's still going to erupt in violence. I think that when it relates to violence, whether in the society or the church, there must be zero tolerance. And I want to add to Dr. Clark's point and to Pastor Moses when he said that people should speak out, people should tell. I think the next step is that we must believe people when they speak and tell. Because sometimes people speak and tell and we don't believe, or we think they're exaggerating. So that's step 2, believe them. And step 3 is that I think the church needs to behave consistent with what we are speaking about and sharing today. Because many times, aggressive behavior in the home tends to be minimized, and people are sent back to their homes to do better or to pray for. That's not enough. Dr. Clark asked the question, how many people are being referred? We need zero tolerance. And one of the things that can cause an abuser to begin to appreciate the need to change are the consequences of his action. And sometimes the consequences involve the abusee, the victim, saying, I'm not prepared to tolerate any more of this. So you need to be able to say, I'm not leaving you. I'm not asking for divorce. I'm not talking here about the separation of a marriage. I'm talking about taking space until that abuser recognizes that he needs to get help and referring him to the necessary counselors and to use the social services that exist. I want to go back to Dr. Clark's point that the best help for a Christian abuser is counseling and Christ. So a Christian counselor is preferable in this case because many times non-Christian counselors will suggest separation or divorce. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for help. So we want a Christian counselor who is going to assist the abuser in changing his or her behaviors and provide support for the person who is being abused. That calls for patience and prayer because change does not take place quickly or easily. And change is change of thinking, change in behavior, but absolute change, the removal of that vulnerability, the removal of that tendency to be aggressive comes from Christ. So that's where prayer is important. So prayer and patience while the abuser heals and the abusee is protected.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you so much. And it has just opened at least my eyes to, well, it is on our strategic plan for sure to create a cadre of skilled professionals to assist in this given area. We have not yet fully satisfied that. What we have been doing so far is sharing information. Now we come down to taking action. And therefore, the Family Life Department, along with the Men's Ministries Department, certainly will have to now widen its borders to create a cadre of professionals where we can make referrals. Of course, we do make some referrals. I have done that, as the Family Life Director. We have been referring persons. I sent some to Dr. Reed myself. I sent some to Dr. Clark also. There are other persons that would have been referred elsewhere. But there is the need for a systematic approach to this whole thing. Just simply talking about it, we are discovering, is just not enough. And the truth is, our community is infected with persons like that, and therefore action has to be taken in a very meaningful way. Pastor Moses, you want to come back in?
Yes. Yeah, just add one quick point, and that is, programs like these are very helpful.
Yes.
Because they are not the end of the road in terms of helping.
Mm-hmm.
And so a program like this would and should create awareness.
Yes.
That members of the church can find a way out of their abusive relationship. They're not alone. Several avenues have been spoken about. Several things have been suggested. And not only, Pastor Sampson, should we restrict ourselves to a program on a large scale like what we are doing here today, but how wonderful it would be if in every church in the South Caribbean Conference, other professionals are brought together to talk to the issue, to put it on the front burner of the church, if you please, to create an awareness in our congregations that there is a zero tolerance. Dr. Reed said it perfectly, zero tolerance on this kind of behavior, whether it's coming from the head of the church or from the child in the church, zero tolerance. And if we can all speak the same language and give people the impression that when they speak, we would listen and we would act, then indeed this place would be a better place. We'd have healthier families.
Beautiful. Thank you, Pastor Moses. And if I would use this platform to just throw in this, I mean, as a moderator, I'm sneaking it as if I'm a facilitator. But we do have the men's ministries that seek really to create a cadre of men that we can describe as the better man. To become a better man, there's a curriculum that we are going around with to get our men involved. I certainly wish and I hope that coming out of this particular program, the need for men's ministries in each church will be understood, and not just simply allowing the conference on its own to come around and do things, but create that space. If men can get together and talk issues over, a man might be a lot more vulnerable with other men and such alike, and those other men can then refer him to where serious help can be had. We have to create a community where men can feel safe enough to come and talk. It's not simply talking about men, but now talking to men. Certainly, this evening's exercise should open our eyes to the significance of the men's ministries department. We get men right, and a number of things certainly will be changed. Is there any other action that should be taken in order for some measure of safety to be had by those who are exposed to individuals who carry the propensity to be abusers? Any other action that one would want to suggest? Is there any other?
Well, I just sorry. Someone wants to say something?
Yes. Go right along, Dr. Clark.
Okay, I just wanted to make the point when you were talking about early signs and symptoms of abuse type behavior that's non-sexual. If you are in a relationship in which the person responds very negatively to slights or is very hyper-vigilant about where you go, how long you stay, when you're coming back, and all of that, high level of sensitivity. And they tell you that this is because I love you. This is why I need to know where you're going and when you're coming back and all of that. You need to monitor that, because that level of hypervigilance is not normal. It's not normal in a relationship. A relationship will be one that's founded on trust. And excuse me. And if you're in a relationship and this partner has to be monitoring you, says he wants to know when you're coming and going, okay, there is a place for that, because we live in an age where crime is everywhere. And therefore, it can be argued, you're coming and you're going, I need to know, and so on. But you need to put it within a context. But so that you monitor it. Because if the person seems to be too controlling, you don't have any say in anything, and it's only his way and no way. You have no say. These are all minor or nursery bed indications that you need to monitor, because you must understand that control, taking over, monitoring, these are all activities that should not be common in a love marital relationship. I mean, if you're in a relationship and you love each other and you're Christian minded, and he doesn't trust you, or you don't trust him, of course there might be a history to go with this, because of some infractions in fidelity and so on. But outside of those issues, then you need to be very guarded, because further on in the relationship, it can be a trigger. For instance, there was a case that comes to mind where this chap was very hyper vigilant, and he just saw his partner talking to someone else. He didn't know what it was about. He had issues around communication, and most batterers have issues about communications. They're not assertive in their communication. They tend to be aggressive in their communication. So he took her outside, and he didn't ask, well, who were you talking to, and why were you talking to him? And he just tried to choke her, and to get. He felt that by putting his hand around her neck, he could get the truth, because he didn't think that she would tell him the truth. Of course, she protested, but her protestation was seen as a way of, not telling the truth. So it became a vicious cycle where he asserted more force to get the truth out of her, and of course, in the end, he almost killed her. And then he said that he wasn't aware that it had gone that far, etc., etc. So you need to be very aware, and that's the thing about emotional intelligence. You have to be aware of your emotions and understand them, and the emotions of others. Because if you don't understand the emotion of others, you might say something that triggers your partner to react negatively. And therefore, if you know that saying something is going to fire him off, why say it? Why say it? So you need to understand the role in emotions, both in self-monitoring and being able to have meaningful relationships. So it's really important that, going back to, I'm just pulling us back to emotional intelligence, where we are aware of, we are self-aware and we are other-aware. Because if we're just self-aware and we're not other-aware, we're going to say, we're going to act, we're going to express remarks, offhanded remarks, which only lead to flare-ups, which then become physical encounters. He's arguing and he raises his voice and you raise your voice. Well, of course, if he raises his voice and you raise your voice and he raises, there's only one way it's going to go. So you need to be able to monitor and say, okay, see, this is getting out of hand. I better lower my voice, avoid this thing becoming a confrontational interaction. So knowing your emotions, knowing the emotions of your partner is really important in the way that you interface is in marital relationships.
Thank you so much. Now we want to pull it together. We have spoken about men, the veil, moving back the veil for us to understand where men are coming from. I started off by saying that every man has a story and every man is living in the midst of a story, whether the story is positive or negative. And he needs to understand that story in order for him to move along. And then we also spoke about persons who may have to share a space with men who have negative or who have wounds as described by Pastor Lowe. To put it together, we want to speak to those two groups. First of all, I'm asking two of the facilitators to speak to men. If you have to speak to men with who may very well be predisposed, if triggered, to go that direction. If you have to speak to a man like that, you talk to him. And then I'm going to ask two other persons to speak to persons who share space with a man who may very well be an abuser, a potential abuser, or maybe observing a man who can be. Talk to those people for us, please, so that a sense of self for the man can be had and a sense of self-preservation for the others can also be had. Whereas we come together in God thereafter to deal with the scourge that sin would have brought among us between those two genders, male and the female. I'm going to ask Pastor Lowe to talk to men. Talk to men. I'm going to ask Pastor Moses to speak to the church generally, who have to respond and share a space with the potential abusers or even abusers themselves. But the church is a hospital. How should we relate to that? Let's talk to that. And then the two doctors can help us pull what we have spoken together from your perspective, Dr. Reed, the psychology behind it, Dr. Clark would have kind of inadvertently share his closing remark with our emotions, understanding our emotions, and pull it together. But let each presenter take just about a minute and share, talking to Pastor Lowe, talking to men, Pastor Moses talking to the church, and the two doctors speaking from the medical standpoint or professional standpoint on the particular area that they were asked to speak on. Dr. Reed would have been asked to talk to the influences, Dr. Clark, self-awareness, emotional intelligence. Pastor Lowe, would you please start the pulling in process? Unmute your mic, please, my brother.
Right, it's good enough. Yes, thanks. Not because a man might be comfortable in wrongdoing, makes it right. And he has to understand that there comes a time and where he has to recognize that, listen, I have to try to get help, even though the other person meaning well for him can't change him, but he must recognize that there comes a time when he needs help. And that help would come from therapy and from God. So there's those two sources of help: the help that comes from God and the help that comes from therapy. He must self-realize that, listen, I need help and I must come to get help. And even though he's comfortable and there might be some sort of validation for what he does and he might feel good, doesn't mean that it's okay. You're destroying somebody else's life. You're even destroying your life, because at some point in time, it's going to come to a head. Like Dr. Clark said, he needs help, needs to get counseling, and he also needs to tap in on the changing power of Jesus in his life.
Okay, I'll ask the two doctors to speak before Pastor Moses, who will give the final thoughts there. Dr. Reed and Dr. Clark.
Okay, I will be happy to follow. I think we must understand how the emotional brain works. We didn't have time to go into the emotional brain in any serious way. But the way we think about things determine how we feel and how we act. That is a fundamental principle. And very often we aren't fully aware that when we see or when we hear or we see something happening, our emotions, we react to it rather than respond. And this is probably because we are hardwired to react rather than respond. So we have, what we sometimes call a knee-jerk reaction. But we are hardwired over the years. Once we hear this is what we're going to do. Triggers. So I think that in relationships, and this has been said quite a few times by persons who do emotional intelligence and couple therapy. Uh, the communication between couples, very, very, very important. Communication is the lifeblood of relationships, and how we communicate is fundamental to how we feel about each other and how we would react to each other. And so therefore the issue very often is not when we argue, it is about what we do when we don't argue. What are we doing when we don't argue? Are we having a nurturing, building relationship, or is it one of distance? And therefore, we only get together when we argue or we disagree. So I think that's important that going forward, couples need to be more self-aware of what's happening in their relationship. And then they need to understand each other's fault lines, because we all have fault lines. We are not void of that. And knowing our own and knowing our partners gives us the ability to determine how we feel, and then how we respond to our partners' perceptions and feelings and actions. And of course, all of that is put within the context of Christian living. Very often we try to separate these things. It needs to be put within the Christian living. Because if that is central, then our thoughts are going to be ones that are uplifting, they are positive, and they are developmental. Our emotions will be such that we can self-regulate. We'll be able to say, okay, let's not argue about that. If there's something that we can't agree on, we say, okay, let's pray about it, or let's leave it, talk about it another time. We must be able to walk away, come back, and then our actions will be ones that are uplifting, they're motivational, modeling for the children that's in our home. We can never forget that those individuals in our homes are looking on, and they are absorbing everything that's taking place between mom and dad, and between how you treat Robert and John, or Robert and Mary, or whoever. So we need to have that Christian understanding of our purpose, and determine that the way we think will influence greatly the kind of life we have together as couples.
Thank you so much. Before I take Dr. Reed and then Pastor Moses, there seem to be a couple questions coming in, and I will not want us just to close off without relating to those questions. So if the questions are, I'm told that there are some questions. So if those questions are there, let them come through now, and the facilitators will seek to answer them. All right. If not, as we wait for the questions to come through, Dr. Reed, you will give your pulling in comments, please.
Sure. Thank you, Pastor Samson. So my closing words would speak to the perpetrators, persons who engage, well, I don't want to say perpetrators, persons who engage in aggressive behaviors. My responsibility was to speak as to the why. I would say to them, you might have been a victim of hurt and abuse. You might be living in a society that accepts your aggressive behavior. You might be taught by society that your dominance over woman is the right way, and you may believe that the church says the same thing. I would advise, examine your behavior. Decide whether your behavior matches the standard that God has set for you and your loved ones. Examine the scripture to see whether male dominance is sanctioned by God. Because in biblical submission, there is no place for aggressive dominance, no place for aggression and dominance in love and marriage, and the church would never excuse or tolerate it. So I say to you, you can get help. By God's grace and through his power, with the help of professionals, you can change
Thank you
your
so much,
behavior.
Doc. And there are several questions that I think need to be answered. Our time is far gone. And of course, in discussion with the president, we will consider answering those questions in part 2, because it really takes us to part 2 to something, a program like this. But Pastor Moses, use the closing moments, please, to speak to the church. Our response to abuse, our attitude with those who may be even perpetrating such an action. Talk to the church, please, because the church has a position. The church stands for some things, and the church operates in a particular way. Would you speak to God's people then?
Right, Pastor Sampson, I was just going through the chat to figure, see there were questions. I haven't seen any yet. And I'm hoping that we can answer questions if there are questions. But let me just indicate that the Seventh-day Adventist Church has zero tolerance for all forms of aggressive behavior, whether it is male to female intimate partner violence, female to male intimate partner violence, sexual violence against children, sexual violence, and aggression in the marital realm, zero tolerance. And as a church, we cannot be afraid to talk to these topics and to these issues. There are a lot of taboo topics in the church, especially on the Sabbath. We shouldn't be talking about this, and we shouldn't be talking about that. Leave the people to solve their own problems. And I think the church is precisely the place to address these issues, Pastor Sampson. And I'm just giving permission to pastors and elders and church leaders to open the church to discuss these very sensitive issues and make it appropriate, age appropriate, so that every last child, every human being in the congregation can be privy to what has to be said in regard to these topics. I'd also like to indicate, I spoke to it earlier, and I just want to re-emphasize it, because this is, for many people, new territory. The issue of shaming the victim, we know how to do that in the church. We know how to castigate the woman who's complaining that her husband who is an elder of the church, or her husband who is a pastor of the church, is slapping her or cuffing her or raping her. And we can't see the man of God like that. And so we shame the victim and we glorify the perpetrator. As a church, we need to care for every last member, whether the person is a victim or a perpetrator. We have a role to play in helping all of our members. And the psychologists and psychiatrists on the team today spoke to it while we would pray with them and pray for them and help them through prayer. These matters need professional intervention. So the professional, along with the spiritual intervention, would be the only way to solve these issues and to solve them permanently by God's grace. And so that is how I would end, Pastor Sampson. We have a role to play in caring for all. Of course, I should indicate if there is a sexual predator in the congregation and there has been talk around the place about him interfering or her interfering with the children, then we need to keep an eye out for our children in the church. Do not assume that because he went up to the altar for prayer, that would solve his problem or solve her problem. We need to keep our eyes open. Somebody had on the chat the issue of screening or volunteers in church. We also need to know who has, the responsibility to look over our children in Sabbath school and in Pathfinders and in other places and spaces where children can become vulnerable. And I heard talk about, young people saying, well, he never did it to me, so he's innocent. The fact is, a perpetrator will not go at every child. A perpetrator will go at the vulnerable ones. And those are the ones who will eventually be targeted and victimized. So let us look out for all of our children and all of our women. And there are some men, Pastor Sampson. This is not to talk about female perpetrated violence, but I just want to put it out there that there are some women who are also perpetrators, and of course the men are the victims.
All right. Thank you, panelists, for the comments shared to bring this program to an end. Of course, for me, this program would have opened my mind for the need, would have shown the need for the widening of our function. Yes, we do have certain programs laid out, but there is a need for further skillful intervention, noting that the scourge of abuse is not simply on the outside, it is now also a part of our community. So we need to start to develop safe spaces for both the perpetrators to find a place for healing to take place, and for those who may be exposed to abuse one way or the other, a place of support got to be created for them. We need to begin to think seriously about creating that space, identifying the felt needs here given to us, and create a space where support can be given. Of course, Pastor Moses spoke about speaking out, for sure. Gone are the days when we simply keep things down and not want to bring shame, as it were, on us. If there is a situation like that, there is a need for us to speak out and for us to take action. However, we are not just simply ending there. We are also telling our brothers, we are telling all our brothers, not just those that we know will be heading in that direction, because as I said before, every man is living in the midst of a story. And it's until the crisis comes or the temptation comes, you will discover how steep you are in your brokenness. I am encouraging us men to take a look at yourself, not from another man's perspective, but from God's perspective. As a matter of fact, you take time to relate to that, you discover that there are already established realities for you, man. God has done that. And if only we come back to where God wants us and function from that perspective, as a man, life can be vastly different. But as Pastor Lowe would have pointed out, you have come to the place where you have to make a decision. Not taking life for granted. No, not pursuing your comfort, pursuing your need for significance and control in a non-godlike manner, but to now go through life with an understanding that, hey, I was created in the image of God, and there got to be something more for me here. You have to make a choice, really, to go through life and to relate to life from God's perspective that way. You do just that, you can become a part of the Better Men's movement that we have in our church. Yeah, there's a curriculum that we are following there in that context that will certainly assist any man to awaken his consciousness. Of course, in the process, you may discover that there is the need for you to have some professional help. Then we can do some referrals then. But come be a part of that body. And together we press on, iron sharpening iron, ensuring that the will of God is not only revealed to us, but we plunge into the river of God's will and allow the current of His grace to move us to where He wants us to be. I pray that God will bless us to this end. We have removed the veil. We have looked at the influences that can impact a man's life, that can drive him into that path. But we have also given to you the tool. Professional help can be had. And of course, with God, all things are possible. And there is a space where a man can identify, find a place, and that's in the Better Men's Movement. Be a part of that group and let manhood take on that which God would have prescribed. For us to end our program this evening, I will invite Pastor Lopre to open. I'm inviting our spiritual leader, Pastor Moses, to pray for us then, that God will hold us, men who are prone to that direction in our brokenness, to be quickened by the Spirit and to reach out for help in an appropriate manner. And for those of us who are living around those individuals, to be sensitive, to be aware, and even to the point where we seek help for them to take action, positive actions, not only to stop them from committing evil acts, but to promote or to provoke them to go in a direction that is meaningful. Let's pray, please, then.
Our Father in heaven, we thank you for the conversation we had today in respect of violence and aggression as it relates to the masculine gender and its effect on the other members of the society and specifically the family. We acknowledge today, Lord, that we are broken. Even in the church, all that we hear about out in the world, we see in the church. And so we pray, Lord, that you will forgive us first for ignoring or belittling the realities of these occurrences. And we pray, Father, that you would help us as a church to do better. Help us to be more responsible. Help us to set up support groups, maybe in our local churches, not just for the men, but for the others who are suffering and who would like to be better. I pray, Lord, for your intervention in the lives of our brothers, our boys. Many of them are already being bent in the direction that would lead to violence and abusive behavior. I pray, Lord, that something we do today, something we did today, and something we will do in the future in our local church, in our homes, will help to bring our boys back and to save our nation, save our church. At this time, Lord, I want to pray for people who are suffering silently, and maybe those who are suffering audibly. They are speaking up, but they are still suffering. I pray that you would help our victims to get the intervention, to get the help that is needed, to get to somebody who could lead them to a path of healing and restoration. Please, Lord, help us not to push them away or to sideline them or to belittle them. Help us, dear God, to treat with them and to treat with them well for their healing and their restoration. Now, Lord, we pray that you would give us the skills and the tools. On the program today, the need for professionals, Christian counselors, to be instruments of intervention came out loud and clear. Please, dear God, help us as a church to provide more and more of those types of professionals so that our people can go to the right place and to the right persons. And if there are none of those where we are, help us to go wherever we can find help so that help can be achieved and lives can be saved. Please take this program and what we did today, Lord, and send it out into the highways and the byways of the virtual world so that more and more persons can at least get a glimpse of what is possible, what is normal, what is abnormal, and find a way to make it better. Thank you for Pastor Sampson and to the other panelists. Thank you for the contributors to the program. And we pray, Lord, that you would use us, dear God, to do much more for you and for your people. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Pastor Moses. And note you well, people, there is a battle plan coming out of this program. One, let us resist being passive now. We need to take action. And when I say that, I'm not here talking about grabbing the collar of those that may have been involved in abusing others. No. But let's stop the violence by getting involved in developing some kind of meaningful campaign as in small groups or whatever, or creating that cadre of professionals. We want to develop that now to stop the violence. Be a part of it in whatever area you can. If we have professionals, we will be tapping into that, because that came out clearly in our meeting today, in our program this today, that we need a cadre of professionals that we can refer people to. We do have professionals among us who can assist there, and we shall be reaching out to you. We do have the women's ministries department that carries through small groups and such alike. The men have theirs just the same. Be a part of that. And within those groups, there are activities that can raise the awareness about how to stop violence against girls, young women, and men. May God help us then to take action, take responsibility, and lead with courage, knowing ultimately that we have to give God an account for our stay in this world. May God bless you, and thanks to the panelists, Dr. Clark, Dr. Reed, Pastor Lowe, and our spiritual leader, Pastor Moses. Thank you very much for spending the evening with us, viewers online and others. Thank you so much, and may God bless us and bless us in a significant way. Go with God. Victory is yours.